Hello there. So I've just bought a house, and the eagle-eyed viewers among you may notice that it looks suspiciously similar to my previous house, and that's because it is. I just bought the house I was living in, so yeah, it looks virtually the same. Not exactly the same, a lot of the furniture is gone because basically my parents have moved out. That's why I'm just sitting in front of the fireplace. I thought you weren't quite ready for a completely new setup. So in this video, I thought I would tell you the entire process of buying a house, all the ups and downs. But before I jump into that, I want to address something. I haven't uploaded a video for 2 weeks. The longest time that I haven't uploaded a video in years. And I want to tell you why. Well, firstly, I bought a house, that's why. A couple of weeks ago I was doing some decorating at my parents' new house, moving stuff around here, so I literally just didn't have the time. I just had to not put up a video. And then last week I was doing something very exciting. I was filming something for actual television. That will go out sometime before Christmas, maybe. I'm not allowed to give you any more details than that. I know that's really annoying. That's the typical YouTuber thing, isn't it? But I basically just want to tell you why there wasn't an upload last week. But I'm going to get straight on with the video. After a cup of coffee. I'm 32, live with my parents for quite a long time, so as you can imagine, I was a little bit desperate to buy my own place. So I've been saving for years, and I had more than enough money, to be brutally honest. My parents were very supportive of me and let me just kind of live rent-free, which is nice of them. Some people are going to think that's probably unfair, but I earn an alright salary as a scientist. What was a problem for me was just kind of getting off my arse and doing it and finding a place I wanted to actually live, which ended up being the place I was already living. But the very first thing that's extremely important and did trip me up a few times is actually knowing your budget, okay? You need to know what kind of house you actually can afford. Now, there is a rule of thumb. Now, most people don't buy houses in cash. Most people take out a mortgage. A mortgage provider will lend you about 4.5 times your salary. In very special cases, maybe sort of 5 times your salary, but that is about it. So if you want to buy a house for £200,000, for instance, and you earn £30,000 a year, you can basically assume that the bank will lend you about £150,000, and you would need the extra £50,000 in cash to be able to buy a house. The other rule is that you need about a 10% deposit typically. So on a £200,000 house you would need £20,000. There are some mortgages out there that will let you do it for sort of 5%, but they are few and far between, and as is usually the case, the less money you put in, the less money you've got, the worse the rate you get. So you kind of get screwed over if you've got less money. It seems to always be better to put down more of a deposit to get a better interest rate. Now, mortgage providers are kind of geared towards couples. So if you're a single person, your household income is going to be half that of a joint applicant, and that's one of the reasons why in the UK house prices have risen so sharply over the last 20 years, the rise of joint applicant mortgages. So you are at a disadvantage if you are applying by yourself. If you've got a partner, it's probably a good idea to apply with them. Now, obviously, I should caveat all this and say this is just my experience, my personal sort of subjective experience of buying a house. I'm not a financial advisor, and you should do your own research, obviously. But from my understanding, one of the biggest things that catches people out is they've got no idea how much money they can borrow. They assume they can borrow an infinite amount of money, and then they find a house they want, put in an offer, and then they can't actually buy it because the bank won't lend them the money. As I said, I was very lucky. I was able to live at home, didn't really have to sacrifice much. I don't really buy much for myself other than sort of fancy technology and a nice-ish car, and eat out a few times, but a lot of people have to sacrifice all those sort of luxuries in order to save money for a deposit, because another perverse thing here in the UK is that it's extremely expensive to rent privately. So a lot of people who rent before they actually go out and buy, they find it extremely difficult because they're spending much more renting than they would be if they actually had a mortgage. And because I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not going to go into the whole fixed rate, variable rate mortgage stuff. There are probably loads of great videos out there that explain about that. So once you know what kind of price bracket you're in, you can start looking on Rightmove and estate agent websites, and you will quickly discover, if you start looking around the houses that you are interested in, that the pictures don't always add up. So estate agents, one of the things, well, the only thing they're really good at is using a telephoto lens to make a house look bigger than it actually is, and to kind of hide the things that are a little bit suspect about the house. Other than that, estate agents, I'm sure, I don't want to generalise, but they are scum of the earth. Ask them anything about the house you're looking around, they won't know the answer. Ask them about the local area, they won't know the answer. Ask them anything, they won't know the answer. They are basically a kind of monkey that carries the keys and opens the door for you, and then stands there reeling off platitudes as you look round the shabby house. So a lot of the places that I looked around with my parents, because obviously I knew I was going to buy this, but they were looking at other places, and what we noticed was that, you know, places would be much dirtier, like filthy, to be honest, than they looked in the photos. Rooms would be much smaller, and in the worst cases, houses would have quite serious apparent structural problems. Bloody great cracks going all the way across a room or something that, you know, if you're not a structural engineer, could lead you to think that there was quite a serious problem with the house. But eventually you will look round somewhere that you think, yeah, this is all right. I think it's time for me to put in an offer. So the asking price is just an asking price. You shouldn't be afraid to offer lower than that. But there are some things that could sort of catch you out. So, for example, auctions. Auction listings tend to always list the house price much lower than it should be, and it's basically to draw attention, to get people interested in the listing. So you can see a house that typically would go for £400,000 listed for £300,000. Well, you can bet your bottom dollar that at auction it doesn't go for £300,000, so it's something to just be kind of wary of. And obviously, the more competitively priced a house is, the more likely you are to get into a bidding war and sort of be gazumped. So when you put an offer in on somewhere, typically it's about 10% below the asking price. What always happens at that point, unless the seller is absolutely desperate, is they come back to you and, or the estate agent sort of mediates between you and then comes back to you and says, oh, can you raise your offer just a little bit? They just want you to give a few £1,000s extra to sort of make them feel like they've bled you dry. My parents got into a bit of a bidding war with some people, and the price went up a bit. It went actually above the asking price, but the house they bought was still excellent value. But you should always stick within your budget, because ultimately, unless you've got the cash, you won't actually be able to go through with the transaction. And it's very embarrassing to then turn around to everyone involved and say, yeah, actually, can't buy it anymore. And when your offer has been accepted, you should try and make sure that the estate agent, all the estate agents who've got the listing on their websites, that they remove it from their websites, because while that listing is still up, other people can still be seeing it, still requesting to look around the property, and then you can be gazumped, i.e. they just bid higher than you and steal it from under your nose, which could be quite an expensive thing if you've gone on to some of the next steps in this process. So the next step is to really appoint a solicitor. They're going to deal with all the legal matters to do with buying your home. They will deal with the solicitor of the seller's party. They'll organise all the searches to make sure that your house isn't built on a ancient burial ground or has got some sort of covenant where the church can sue you for £1 billion if they will need a new roof, you know, that sort of thing. So it's quite important to go with a good solicitor. In my experience, all the prices seem to be sort of pretty standard. My legal fees were about, I think, £1,300. I bought a leasehold flat, so actually it worked out a little bit more expensive than if I bought a freehold, probably about £300 more expensive, because there were a lot of sort of leaseholder documents and things to get hold of. But yeah, as a general rule of thumb, between £1,000 and £1,500, depending on the value of your house. Obviously, if you're buying a very expensive house, things sort of scale accordingly. Now, I've got coffee all over my face. Now, the legal process is a long, lengthy process. Don't be thinking that you can put an offer in on the 1st of January and have your house bought a week later. The process takes months. For me, I first approached a solicitor in November, I think, 2018, and my purchase actually completed in March, I think. So it was 3 or 4 months before my purchase went through. And my particular purchase, there was no chain, so there were no other people I was waiting to complete other purchases before I could complete mine. Mine was as straightforward as it could be, and it just took a long time. And that was despite chasing my solicitor, chasing my mortgage company, organising everything. As soon as I got a letter through the door, I'd fill it in and send it back. It is just a long process. I'm sure it varies and it depends on the efficiency of the solicitor you go with, but yeah, don't expect it to be fast. And actually, thinking about it, that's quite a good message for this whole video, really, in terms of cost and ease and stress. Everything costs more than you expect, everything takes more time, and everything is surprisingly more stressful than you would expect. So a solicitor will typically want evidence of your funds, that you're not just kind of stringing everybody along, but they will organise the searches and do all the legal stuff. While that's going on, you need to start applying for your mortgage. Now, I went through a price comparison website and found a good deal for myself. A number of people I know went with mortgage brokers, so these are people you pay typically about £500 and they find the best deal for you. They find deals that aren't available on the internet to the general public. Maybe a good idea if you're not very tech savvy or you've got particularly unusual circumstances, maybe you're, I don't know, part-time or something, but I thought I would risk not paying somebody 500 quid and it seemed to work out pretty well. I've got pretty unusual circumstances in that I basically work long, short-term contracts, and it all worked out just fine. There is something called a mortgage in principle, which will give you a general idea of how much you can earn. But let me tell you, these things aren't worth the paper they're written on. They're basically a very simple calculation, I believe, based on the numbers you put in, and it does not mean that a mortgage company will lend you the money. It just means that, yeah, in principle, that's approximately what they'd lend you. The actual procedure they go through to make sure that you can afford the mortgage is much more strict. I went with a reputable high street bank, Barclays I think I went with. Got a really good interest rate. Yeah, it was absolutely fine. So I had a few appointments in my local city where they kind of went through my finances. They wanted evidence of bank statements for the last 3 months. They asked me about my savings. They asked me about a whole host of things. Now, usually the application process can be quite long and drawn out and they can decline you. Now, some mortgage companies have a mortgage application fee, and I don't know if I'm correct in saying this, but I didn't want one of those because I didn't want to be potentially declined for a mortgage and then have to pay the application fee. But anyway, I didn't want an application fee stuck onto my mortgage at the end of it. So I was able to use a Barclays one that didn't have an application fee. And because of my sort of financial situation, I was accepted straight away without a kind of detailed analysis. In fact, I think the computer system just kind of said, yeah, okay, this is fine, we don't need to do any further investigation. But acceptance of my mortgage application was subject to a kind of house valuation. So mortgage companies, they're quite funny people. They want to make sure that you're actually buying a house that exists and isn't going to fall down, because ultimately they're lending you all this money, and if you stop being able to pay your mortgage, they want to be able to repossess it and sell it on, which they wouldn't be able to do if you'd bought a Wendy house in disrepair in the middle of a field. So yeah, they will typically arrange, I think it's called like a home buyer survey. Someone will just come and look round and make sure it's all right. On the topic of surveys, you're going to probably want to make sure yourself that what you're buying is structurally sound and, is worth the money. So you may arrange a survey yourself. There are basically, as far as I understand it, 3 different classes of survey. There is the sort of home buyer survey, which obviously if the mortgage company's done and they're satisfied, you probably should be too. But there's also a kind of middle of the road survey where they'll tell you what's wrong with your house, what could go wrong. These surveys are all a kind of arse covering exercise, okay? These survey companies are going to point out every single thing that possibly could go wrong with your house, because if it does go wrong, they don't want you to be able to blame them that they didn't notice it, if that makes sense. So yeah, you need to take a lot of what surveys say with a pinch of salt. And typically you can have a kind of discussion on the side with the surveyor and say, look, do I need to really worry about this? And they will kind of give you a kind of more rounded opinion. There is a higher level of survey called a full structural survey, typically reserved for much older buildings, grade 2 listed buildings or whatever, or buildings that you're particularly worried about, or if you're just a particularly anxious person and you want to make sure that, the roof is all right or whatever. But ultimately, the surveyor isn't going to know everything and your house could fall down, but it's extremely unlikely. In terms of cost, a middle of the road survey costs about £400, but again, it depends entirely on the value of the house you're buying. And typically, all of these things, like arranging a sort of survey, they've got a minimum of a kind of week or two's lead time, certainly in my fairly small city. So you've got to factor all of these things in. Obviously, you've got to be available to show them around. So it can be quite difficult to book that sort of time off at work. So once you're satisfied that your house is structurally safe, you're moving towards exchange of contracts. So this is the point where you're legally bound to buy the property that you're trying to buy. If you back out at that point, you can be sued by the seller of the house. So it's extremely important that before you sign any contracts, you are happy with the purchase you're making. Now, there are other costs associated with buying a house, certainly here in the UK, most notably stamp duty. So if you're a first-time buyer, actually in the UK now, you don't have to pay it up to a certain value of house or something. But if you're not a first-time buyer, if you're buying an average size house, sort of £250,000 for instance, you're going to pay about £2,500 in stamp duty to the government. Who knows what it's for, but just beware. And once you have exchanged contracts, because you're legally obliged to buy that house, what I've certainly read online is that at that point you need to have buildings insurance on the house you're buying, because if it blows up or falls down, you are still legally obliged to buy that plot. So get buildings insurance. If you've got a leasehold property, like I have, you probably don't need buildings insurance, and you should check with your landlord, as they're called, but you will need contents insurance. So if there's a leak or something, or somebody breaks in and steals all your stuff, you need contents insurance so that you can buy new stuff, basically, and it's cheap, to be honest. My contents insurance, I think, is about £3.50 a month. Now, one of the things I know that people really underestimate is moving, okay? You've got a load of stuff, maybe you've been renting. Moving is not a trivial thing. A lot of people think they're going to hire a van, stick it all in the van themselves and move that way. Okay, if you own a couple of sofas and one bookcase full of books, okay, you probably can. But if you're an established family with lots of books, if you like, and lots of furniture, it is not going to be an easy job to move all your things. And typically, people will hire a removals company to do it all for you. And they will charge, for an average size house, about £800. Now, there are 2 other aspects of moving. There's the packing of all your stuff into boxes, because a bookcase full of books is not going to be moved with all the books in the bookcase. And at the other end, the books have then got to be unpacked again and put back in the bookcase. Some people try and do this themselves and perhaps underestimate the time and the effort of trying to do this process. It is a back-breaking and time-consuming thing. My parents decided to get a removals company to do all the packing for them, and it cost, I think, about a few £100 to get the removals company to do that. They decided to unpack themselves at the other end, but it was back-breaking, and to be honest, I think they wish that they'd paid the removals company to unpack as well. So it's worth bearing in mind. So in total, you're going to be talking at about, a maximum probably for an average size house of about £1.5 if you get them to pack and unpack at both ends. And I've jumped around a little bit here, but obviously before you can move into it, you actually need to complete on a purchase. So this is the point where the money is legally transferred from you through a solicitor to the seller of the house, the point where you legally own it. And this is also the date that you get the keys for the house you're buying. And this is where estate agents come in again and everything up. It is notoriously difficult to get the keys from person A to person B, especially when you're an idiotic estate agent. In my particular case, I already had the keys, but in my parents' case, the keys for their property ended up travelling, I think, 40 minutes away by car because an estate agent accidentally picked up the wrong set of keys. I've also heard stories of keys taking 6 hours to get from one side of a road to another side of a road. Estate agents are basically good at one thing, pretending that their job is more than opening a door and letting somebody look around a house. And then once you're actually in your house and you've got all your things, there are still surprises, okay? So where furniture is moved away, you will notice that, okay, the walls are really worn where the sofas used to be, or the carpet's knackered in that room, or I was so kind of blown away looking around the house I didn't realise that the oven's broken. So there are always hidden surprising costs. So decorating a room, again, is kind of back-breaking work. You think, oh, I'll just put a lick of paint on. Okay, you can do if you want it to look crap, but if you actually want to take some time and do the edges neatly and make it look like it's been done professionally, it's going to take you a lot of time. And even getting some tins of paint or stuff, it's like 40 quid each. It adds up, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So you need to have a kind of reserve fund available for the maintenance that you're going to have to do. And then when you've actually moved in, there are a number of bills to sort out, but I'm going to give you a full breakdown of my monthly costs, how much it costs me to actually live, in another future video. All of my bills from water, electricity, internet, and all that stuff. So that sounds exciting, doesn't it? And there are other time-consuming things too. You need to remember that a lot of companies will want you to change your address on their system. Your driving license, your passport should all be linked to your new address. These things take time. You've got to fill in a form, send it off, usually have to pay for it, so it's more expense. There are just an endless, seemingly, stream of things that you have to do when you move house. Now finally, I'd like to say that this whole process, okay, for me it was quite straightforward because, as I've already said, I was living in the house that I bought. But it is still an extremely stressful thing. For me, I didn't really kind of foresee the stress. I don't think I really noticed that I was getting stressed, but the fact that all this is kind of going on in the background, there are huge sums of money involved, there's a lot of upheaval and change in your life. For me, it was living by myself. It is stressful and it will impact upon your health. I got a cold sore, which is stress-induced. I felt stressed, I dealt with it, but it's just worth bearing in mind. They say that moving house is like one of the most stressful things. Moving house, getting a divorce, and if you think about it, if you get divorced, you probably do both of those. But yeah, that's basically it. So anyway, that about sums it up. I hope that's been a short, well, it hasn't been short, has it? I hope that's been a long explanation of what it's like to move house, the kind of costs and time periods and stresses you can expect to experience. In future videos, I'm going to give you a breakdown of all my monthly costs so you can see exactly how much it costs to live in the UK as a single gentleman. That will probably just descend into a sort of bitter rant about the cost of living, but hey-ho. I might also talk about some kind of financial stuff, my sort of approach to paying my mortgage, in that I overpay it, which, you know, isn't everybody's cup of tea, but I'd like to discuss that with you. Anyway, eventually I will be in sort of more appropriate surroundings, unless you particularly like this. No angry vase, I'm afraid, but never mind. Do subscribe if you enjoy my videos, and I shall see you next time for another one. Where's the remote? Go on. There it is.